Hello, my name is Ryan Smith, and I am a park interpreter here at Louisiana Purchase Historic State Park. And today we are going to do a virtual tour of the park and get an idea of the importance and the significance of this place. Now, Louisiana Purchase Historic State Park is not very big. It's only about 37 acres, and it's at the end of this highway, and it features a boardwalk that goes out to the initial point of lands that were surveyed here in Arkansas and several other states that were acquired in the Louisiana Purchase. And it's a really neat place, and it fits in very well with Arkansas State Parks and part of its mission in to preserve and connect people to Arkansas history, and also to preserve natural areas, which Louisiana Purchase Historic State Park is very significant for that, because the boardwalk goes out into a headwater swamp. And there are very few of these that remain here in eastern Arkansas. And you're going to get to see the swamp a little more up close in detail as we go along today. By visiting Louisiana Purchase Historic State Park, you can experience the natural landscape the 1815 surveyors journeyed through as they created a legacy that lasts even till today. So, to begin with, let's talk a little bit about the Louisiana Purchase. And I have a map here, and this area in white was land that was purchased by the United States from the nation of France in 1803. And it included over 800,000 acres of land that was basically west of the Mississippi River. It included several what would become states. And I should say, this area was not all that well defined. Some of these borders weren't exactly known, and so it was a little vague on just where this all was. This was all pretty much wilderness all through this area. So after the land was purchased, the United States government had a problem, because they needed a way to pay soldiers who had fought in the War of 1812. And the United States was a very young nation at the time and didn't have a lot of money to pay these soldiers. And so what they did is they decided to give tracts of land as payment for these soldiers. And we are in one of the areas where these tracts were given. But something had to be done before that. The land had to be measured off into tracts or areas that could be given. This was just vast wilderness out here. Nobody really knew what was out here. And so the land needed to be surveyed. And so what we have here at Louisiana Purchase Historic State Park is the initial point. And what happened is in the year 1815, one surveyor began about 50 miles to the south, and they started to come north. And another surveyor started to the east of here, where the St. Francis and Mississippi rivers meet. And they started to come to the west. And where the two surveyors crossed was the initial point. And we're going to go out to that here in a few minutes. But the surveyor that came from the south started where the Arkansas and the Mississippi River meet. It was pretty common for surveyors in projects like this to start from known landmarks. And those were both known landmarks. And so that's kind of a quick little background of the Louisiana Purchase. But now what we're going to do is we're going to go back here and talk about some of the equipment that they used. The transformation of the land into squares and lines by the surveyor's tools created a legacy that lasts even till today. So if you would like to join me, let's come on down here and take a look at some of the equipment. And let's talk a little bit about these crews. They were made up of the two deputy surveyors. And they were basically the people that were in charge. But you also had other people. Some of the people were chainmen, and you're going to get to actually see what they did here in a few minutes. People who also used the flag to mark things, but it wasn't just people like this. They also had often people who kept camp, and another job, this one was probably the funnest of all, they were hunters. Because the surveyors were busy doing work all the time, they didn't have time to hunt for food. And so they would often bring hunters along that would go off and find food for them to feed the group while they were working. So a lot of different jobs with the crew. So a little bit about their equipment. This is a surveyor's compass. And in 1815, there would have been one out here just like this. And so they would have had this, and another thing that they had was a surveyor's chain. And this is how they would measure the land off. And a surveyor's chain, actually, I should say, there are 80 chains in a mile, and along with that, 40 chains in a half mile. And let's go through what much of the day was for a survey crew. So what they would do is they would have a starting point where they would have a pin like this. This would be from a place that they had already marked like this. And then this would fit in here like this. So then they would need to measure off the chain again. And so the way that they would do this is they would leave that like that, and then they would throw the chain. Now, which way would they throw it? I'm gonna go that way. You might think that the smart thing to do would be to throw the chain out like that so it was to the next point. But this is not the way that they did it. And there's a reason why. Because it was very important. Let me grab another pin right here. Oh, that worked out perfect. Because this was how they measured things off. They wanted it to be straight, and they didn't want there to be any kinks in the chain. And so they would throw it out like this towards the back, and then the head person would drag the chain forward like this, and then the rear chainman would make sure that there were no kinks in the chain and that the chain was being pulled out correctly. Now, as the chain was just about pulled all the way out, the rear chainman would say chain. And that was the sign for the forward person to kind of slow down. We're about out of chain. And then the flagman would be up here with the forward person. And as they pulled this out, they needed to make sure the chain was being dragged in a straight line. And so, that's where the compass comes into play. What they would do is the flagman would stand up there with the forward person, and they would use this to make sure that the line was straight, because if the line's bent, it's not very accurate. And so what they would do is they would continue this process all day long. Now, some other things along with this, every half mile, they would set up a permanent marker. Usually they could do it a couple ways. They could put a post into the ground, but as you can see, there's a lot of trees across this landscape here. And if where the half-mile post was, or where it was supposed to be, you ran into a tree, which happened a lot, they could mark the tree as being where the half-mile line should be. And so that happened a lot also. And another thing that they would do is at each one of these half-mile posts, they would mark witness trees. And what witness trees were, they would do 2 of them at each one, is they would pick out 2 trees that were close by, and they would measure the distance they were away from the posts, and also the angle that they were from them. And the reason they did this is, well, they were witnesses. And so somebody could come along later on and be able to find where the correct marker was. And another thing that they would note were what were called line trees. Now, it worked out pretty good here, actually maybe not so good, is my chain didn't hit a line tree. But I'm going to grab this here. Let's imagine that our chain being dragged like this, and in the line we hit a tree, and that would happen a lot. And if a line tree was along the line, they would mark it, they would write that down and talk about the species of the tree. Now you wouldn't have to take an angle measurement because it's literally right in the line. And that way, someone who comes along later could note this tree as being in the line. Now, another thing, you have to remember the crews, the whole reason for doing this work is because people were going to come and settle in this land. The surveyors also kept notes about what the landscape looked like, whether it was open and prairie or whether it was good for farming. And also they would note things like if they crossed a river or a stream. These notes would all be important later on. And so an area like this would probably be described as low and swampy. Because as you can see, it's pretty low and swampy. So this work was very important because what did it eventually do? I've got a little board here. That we made out. And so you had the two surveyors. One created the line that came east, or came from the east, called the baseline. And the meridian came from the south, like this. And where their two lines crossed, that would become the initial point. And from this initial point, the land could be measured off into townships. And townships were 6 mile squares. And what is good about these is you can reference, like this, like this, land in, do another one like this. Lands here in Arkansas and several other states from this can all be referenced back to this initial point, because this township here is one north of the baseline and one to the east, and vice versa. This is one north and one west, and each one of these townships was further subdivided down into 36 sections. And all of this is based off of the work that the initial surveyors did here in Arkansas. Another thing that's important to note is the two surveyors did not initially meet. Robbins, coming from the east, only came about 26 miles, and Brown came 26 miles, and Robbins came about 50 miles. And Robbins knew that he had encountered this line when they found a couple of the witness trees. And the two of them met up here and camped for a couple days. and then continued on. But then there was another group of surveyors that came and continued surveying to the away from the meridian and the baseline. So you can see the transformation in the lines and squares was a very big project. And if you buy land today, it still uses this same system that was developed in the late 1700s to survey land. So that's kind of a basic description of the initial work that took place here at Louisiana Purchase Historic State Park. Okay, well, let's head down the boardwalk here, and we are going to venture back into the swamp to go to the initial point. And as you can see, the land looks just like it did for the 1815 surveyors. You can see that it's starting to get wetter and wetter, and we are definitely going into a headwater swamp. Okay, so now we are at the initial point where a granite monument was put up to commemorate the survey in 1926. And the roots of the initial point run deep from conflicts that reached across the distant world. First, in 1762, Great Britain and France had just ended a war, and France had lost the war. But they did not want to give the land in the Louisiana Territory to Great Britain. And so what they did is they gave it to their friend who had helped them in the war, Spain. And then Spain controlled the land until the year 1800, when a bully came along. And this bully was named Napoleon. Napoleon demanded that Spain give the land back to France. Now, Napoleon was had a very powerful army. And Spain did not want to go to war over this because they saw the Louisiana Territory mostly as a big backyard that kept the neighboring United States from venturing west and settling lands. And so Spain gave in and gave the land back to France, because Spain knew that the French were not going to let the Americans come in and settle here. And so their big backyard would now be controlled by France to keep the United States out. But then in 1803, Napoleon decided to sell the land to the United States. And there's a lot of reasons for this, and historians debate it. But one reason is that it looked like he was about to go to war with Great Britain. And he did not want the United States to decide with Great Britain. And so that was part of the reason that they sold the land to the United States. And so there was a lot of conflicts and drama that went into the United States getting the Louisiana Purchase. So now, with that, let's take a look around at the swamp here. Your view of the swamp is a screenshot of the natural world saved from the notes of the surveyors. And you can hear the geese overhead, right now. The surveyors kept notes. And I'd like to just read a little bit about what they said. Brown said as he was entering the swamp, the most of this mile, very low and swampy, was cypress and briars and thickety in abundance. Cannot well say what is the bearing of the swamp. And Robbins describes it pretty similar. Balance, low and wet, Tupelo and cypress. And that's a pretty good way to describe what we see out here. Your view is exactly like it would have been when the surveyors were coming here. And some examples of what they talk about are these cypress trees that you can see right over here. This is a good one to look at right here. Cypress is very well adapted for growing in a swamp like this. You can see how it gets these leaves or like roots that grow out of the water like this. And what that does is that helps them breathe, and it also helps them stay stable in the soil. Cypress can grow for hundreds of years, and as you can imagine, there's been many windstorms come through here, and this helps hold them in place. And also, you notice that they have buttresses or widened trunks at the bottom, and this helps them stay stable in the soil. Another tree that's like this is Tupelo, or water Tupelo, I should say. We have a couple of water Tupelos that are over here, and they have trunks that are like that also, that helps them stay stable in the water. And here at Louisiana Purchase Historic State Park, we have a lot of interesting wildlife, like the geese you can hear overhead. But another special one is a bird voice tree frog. And bird voice tree frogs, as you can imagine from their name, like to live in trees. And they are pretty restricted to swamps like this that have lots of Tupelo and cypress. And they are very well adapted for living in trees because on their feet they have sticky pads that are almost, you can almost imagine them being like this with Velcro. And this helps them climb and hold themselves stable up in the trees. And so it's an animal that's very well adapted for this place, and it really shows the significance and why this park is so important, that these trees are protected here. And so as you look across the swamp, it is a screenshot saved from 1815 from the notes that the surveyors took. So, in wrapping up today, we've looked at how the land was transformed into lines and squares by the surveyors' tools, how the initial point has deep roots from conflicts across the distant world, and how the swamp is really a screenshot of that world saved from the notes of the surveyors. And just a couple of things I would challenge you to do is try to remember a plant or animal that we talked about today and one of its adaptations, or even better yet, I would write it down like on a piece of paper. So that's how I can always remember things. A picture's worth a million words. And also, I encourage you to go out at a point chosen by your teacher and look around the landscape and mark something down like what the surveyors would have noted in their notes, like a tree that you see, or if there's a creek or a stream or something nearby, something that you think that the surveyors would have noted when they were out surveying. By visiting Louisiana Purchase Historic State Park, you can experience the natural landscape the 1815 surveyors journeyed through as they created a landscape, or as they created a legacy that lasts till today.